Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the sun-baked world of ancient Babylon, not as a king or a priest, but as something far more important, a cook. The ovens are roaring, the air smells like garlic and sheep fat, and the gods are hungry. You're standing in a kitchen that's also a temple, a workplace that doubles as a sacred site. And the first thing you notice is that nothing is written on parchment or papyrus. Recipes here are carved into stone, literal clay tablets, with wedge-shaped scribbles known as cuneiform. You probably won't survive this job, honestly. The heat is stifling, the rules are divine, and one wrong spice ratio might get you scolded by both a human boss and an immortal sky deity. No pressure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where and when you're listening. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the narrow alleys of a market district that smells like roasted onions and ambition. Babylon stretches endlessly in every direction, a brick and reed sprawl that hugs the Tigris and glows orange in the rising sun. Chickens squawk. A man hawks something that smells like sweet beer and vinegar. But you're not here to shop. Nope. You're here to work. You duck into a courtyard shaded with linen sheets and lined with soot-darkened ovens. Welcome to one of the busiest kitchens in the city. Pots bubble with things you can't identify. A boy with calloused feet is rhythmically pounding garlic with a stone. And in the corner sits a flat wooden shelf stacked with something odd, heavy clay tablets, each etched with a maze of wedge-shaped impressions. It doesn't look like a cookbook. It looks like a math exam had a fight with a sidewalk. But make no mistake, these are recipes. The oldest surviving ones in the world, in fact. Dated to around 1750 BCE, these tablets were excavated from Sippar and Nineveh, cities once connected to Babylon's bustling culinary trade. Each one contains about 3 to 5 recipes. But recipe is generous. They're more like prompts. No measurements, no cook times, no preheat oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Just things like, take the meat. Add water. Add herbs. Prepare it. It's like someone chiseled a grocery list into a rock, handed it to the gods, and hoped they knew how to braise. Historians still debate who these were even for. Maybe they were teaching tools. Maybe they were ritual texts meant for priestly use. Or maybe, just maybe, there was a bored chef out there who really wanted to show off his braised kidgoat with sour mash and leek. One recipe mentions a dish called tayu stew, which might involve lamb, blood, milk, and an unusual amount of onions. Another describes Elamite broth, possibly imported from a rival kingdom, a sort of ancient food fusion. You skim the words, trying to imagine the taste. It's hard, especially since even the translations argue over whether kasu means leeks, wild garlic, or that weird green thing the temple boy picked. And you're not just cooking for fun. This is a sacred kitchen. The food you make is not only for humans, but for the gods themselves. Every stew and cake must be prepared in a certain way, stirred in a certain direction, and occasionally sung to. Welcome to the kitchen. The stone's hot. The onions are weeping. And you've got a full day ahead. You blink at the recipe tablet again, as if squinting might make the meaning more obvious. It doesn't. The symbols remain stubbornly abstract, rows of cuneiform wedges like sleepy footprints marching across baked clay. You wonder if this is how all great chefs feel, baffled by instructions and just hoping their soup doesn't offend a divine palate. To be fair, it's not your fault. These tablets were never meant for beginners. Most likely, they were written by and for trained temple cooks who already knew the basics. Things like, don't boil the lentils until they disappear, or never, ever use spoiled goat butter. The tablet isn't your teacher. It's a reminder. A whisper of the dish, rather than a tutorial. You begin your day by chopping aromatics. There are onions, of course, always onions, but also a pungent wild garlic that makes your eyes sting and a resinous herb that may or may not be ancient coriander. The scent is sharp and green, like crushed pine and riverbank mud. Your fingers stain green almost instantly. To your left, a copper pot bubbles over a low fire fueled by dried tamarisk branches. You add water from a heavy jug and throw in a handful of herbs, trying to remember whether the Tayu stew calls for cumin or that other spice, the one that smells like crushed citrus peels and ash. Your supervisor, a stern man with shoulders like a temple gate, grunts and corrects your hand. Cumin it is. You sneak a glance at another tablet. This one is trickier. It references a dish involving sheep's stomach and something translated as moon milk, which scholars still debate. Some say it's a term for yogurt. Others think it might be fermented mare's milk. Still others argue it was metaphorical, a poetic nickname for something far more ordinary, like curds. Historians still argue whether moon milk was literal, symbolic, or a translation error caused by a cracked tablet and a tired archaeologist. Either way, you don't have moon milk. You have goat yogurt. Close enough. The other cooks move like dancers, rhythmic, efficient, unbothered by the heat. One boy fans the fire with a folded palm leaf. Another flips barley cakes on a hot slab of stone. The head cook sharpens his bronze knife slowly, without taking his eyes off a batch of boiling wheat porridge that threatens to scorch. There's a kind of reverence here. Not just for food, but for the act of preparing it. You get the sense that cooking in this kitchen is closer to worship than labor. You remember the prayer the old woman muttered this morning before grinding the lentils, to Nisaba, goddess of grain, bless my fingers, that no bean burn under them. It sounds quaint, until you realize that every single ingredient has a deity behind it. Wheat belongs to Nisaba. Salt is watched by Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water. Even your olive oil has a patron spirit. There is no such thing as a secular salad in Babylon. And every single item you prepare must pass ritual inspection before being offered to the temple altars or the priest's table. The priest cooks, half culinary artist and half bureaucrat, walks slowly from pot to pot, sniffing the air and occasionally dipping a clean reed into a broth. If they frown, you're redoing the dish. If they smile, well, don't get cocky. They rarely smile. You finally plate the stew in a shallow ceramic dish, sprinkle on a garnish of dried mint, and carry it forward with a bow. It disappears into the inner sanctum, where only the most senior priest-chef will have the honor of offering it up to the gods. Or eating it himself, depending on the day. You collapse onto a stool and wipe your brow. The fire has soaked into your bones. Your hands smell like broth and bronze. Your brain, meanwhile, is still trying to remember if the recipe said boil once or boil until the god sneezes. You decide it doesn't matter. After all, if you get it wrong, you'll just carve a new version next week. Preferably into a softer rock. You wake up early the next morning to the sound of a goat braying somewhere in the alley. The sun hasn't yet clawed its way above the baked rooftops, but the kitchen is already stirring, just like yesterday, just like the day before. You're sore in places you didn't know had muscles, and there's ash under your fingernails that no amount of scrubbing seems to remove. Still, you rise. Because today, you're learning about the cakes. Not dessert, exactly. These aren't frosted confections you'd find in a Parisian bakery 2,000 years from now. These are ritual cakes, made from barley and honey, often shaped into circles or animal forms, and offered to deities during festivals or feasts. And in Babylon, there is always a festival. Your instructor this morning is an elderly woman with arms like braided rope and an apron streaked with flowery handprints. She doesn't speak often. She just gestures, occasionally muttering instructions like, fold, not flatten, or, the gods don't like cracked edges. You try not to ask too many questions. She places a slab of dough in your hand. It's sticky, heavy with barley meal and a hint of dried fig. As you knead, your mind wanders. Who invented this recipe? Who first decided that shaping dough into the image of a fish might please the god Enki? Historians still argue whether these ritual cakes were eaten by worshippers or merely displayed, left to harden under the sun as symbolic offerings. Some clay tablets mention cakes being burned before the altar, while others describe celebrants consuming them during temple feasts. The line between food and sacrifice gets blurry fast. And the decorations, oh, the decorations. Some cakes are pressed with stamps that leave intricate patterns, spirals, flowers, celestial symbols. Others are molded by hand into tiny rams or birds. One recipe tablet even references 7 cakes in the shape of turtles. No one's entirely sure why. You imagine a priest pointing proudly to the turtles and saying, "Behold, the sacred snack of the river gods." The woman taps your elbow. Your dough is too dry. She sprinkles in more honey and folds it in expertly. The mixture takes on a shine and softens under your hands. You smell something earthy, almost like roasted nuts. It's strangely comforting. The oven is a dome-shaped tanner, heated by burning palm twigs until the walls glow red. You stick your arm in with a flat wooden paddle and slap the cake against the hot clay wall. It sticks with a satisfying thwack. You watch as it puffs, cracks, and turns golden. Elsewhere in the kitchen, someone is boiling pomegranate molasses for a sauce. Someone else is preparing a dough stuffed with dates and sheep fat. The smells swirl around you, sweet, savory, sharp, burnt. A barley cake tumbles from the oven and lands in your hands like a gift from a fire god. You taste it. It's dry, chewy, with a hint of sourness from the barley and a whisper of fruit. It's not delicious, exactly, but it's honest. Like a bite of history. You can almost taste the memory of the first person who ground grain between 2 stones and decided to try baking it. Later, while cleaning the stone tools, you glance again at the tablet on the shelf. This one is faintly cracked, with part of the recipe chipped away. It begins with, "Take fine flour and honey," then trails off before mentioning something indecipherable about the tears of the moon. You wonder whether that's a poetic metaphor, or if there was once an actual ingredient called that. One theory suggests it was a name for rare tree resin. Another theory? Pure nonsense. The kind of embellishment that creeps into oral tradition over generations of sleepy cooks and proud grandmothers. The kitchen winds down as the heat reaches its peak. The cakes have all been baked, lined up on reed mats to cool. A priest enters to inspect the day's work. He lifts a turtle-shaped cake, nods silently, and leaves. No one breathes until he's gone. You sit on the cool floor, sipping water from a clay cup. You feel tired but satisfied, and strangely proud. Somewhere, perhaps, a god is enjoying your barley turtle. You don't have long to rest. The midday lull never lasts in a Babylonian kitchen, not when there's another ceremony tonight, and the gods are as hungry for pomp as they are for lentils. Today's challenge? Soup. Specifically, a meaty broth known in some tablets as zimzimu, believed to be a rich stew served during elite feasts, both religious and royal. It's one of the oldest recorded recipes in the world, etched carefully into a clay tablet that now resides in a museum far from the heat and chaos of your current kitchen. But for you, it's not an artifact. It's lunch. And maybe a form of worship. You start by tossing sheep fat into a heavy cauldron. It melts with a low hiss, sending up a scent like nutty caramel mixed with something darker. You add chopped leek, then onions, then crushed garlic, working fast before the mixture scorches. The sound is almost musical, bubbling, hissing, the occasional pop as something too cold hits the oil. Then comes the meat. Goat, most likely, though sometimes lamb. You've learned to recognize it by smell. Goat is stronger, muskier, almost sour before it cooks down. You brown it quickly, then pour in water from a large jug, splashing your sandals. This isn't the kind of dish that simmers quietly in a pot for a few minutes. It stews all afternoon, with the fire kept steady and low, fed with dried reeds and small sticks. Your job is to stir. And to stir. And, yes, to stir again. Nearby, another cook is preparing the soup's finishing paste, a mix of spices, herbs, and something chalky white you've been told is dried sour grape powder. You find that detail oddly thrilling. Who first thought to dry grapes not for sweetness, but for tartness? Historians still argue whether this paste was a common addition to most Babylonian dishes or a luxury reserved for temple fare. Some tablets mention it sparingly, while others insist it was necessary for flavor, which sounds suspiciously like an ancient food critic throwing shade. As the soup simmers, you watch fat droplets rise and fall on the surface like lazy suns. Occasionally you skim off foam with a flat wooden spoon and discard it into the ash pit. The smell is evolving, meaty, fragrant, slightly sweet. You add chopped herbs, maybe coriander, maybe something else entirely. The cuneiform recipe isn't always clear. The ancient scribes didn't care about standardization. No teaspoon measurements. Just a handful or until it pleases the nose. A priest glides in, robes rustling. He tastes the soup with a reed straw, eyes you briefly, and says nothing. This is a good sign. You glance at your tablet again. The final instruction is oddly specific. Pour into a black bowl with 4 handles, and serve beside a flatbread offering. You nod. The kitchen assistant hands you a black ceramic bowl that fits the bill. You fill it carefully, wiping the rim with a clean reed. As the soup is whisked away toward the temple courtyard, you wonder if anyone will remember this version of the dish, your exact choices of herb, your split-second decision not to add another pinch of dried garlic. That's why the stone recipes exist, you suppose. Because otherwise the flavors would vanish, like steam rising from the pot. Someone, centuries ago, decided that food was worth preserving, not just in memory, but in permanent, chisel-cut text. A meal turned into language. A taste turned into time travel. You wipe your hands and take a breath. The kitchen is quieter now. A few lentils boil in the corner. A dog snores outside the door. You close your eyes for a moment and think, soup is holy here. And surprisingly hard to get right, the sun is beginning to dip behind the ziggurat, casting long shadows across the marketplace outside, but your day isn't over. Not by a long shot. Because now comes the bread. And not just any bread, but the dense, round loaves that Babylonian temple kitchens were known for. Heavy as bricks, patterned like stars, and rumored to stay edible for weeks. You're not sure if edible is the word you'd use, but you're learning not to argue with ancient starch. Your teacher for this task is a barrel-chested man with soot-stained arms and a fondness for smacking counters when he's pleased. He introduces the flour as if it's royalty, barley from the marshlands, ground with the temple's own millstones. You nod solemnly, as if the flour itself holds divine secrets. The mixing begins. There are no stainless steel bowls or silicone spatulas here. Just a low stone trough, your hands, and a sense of resignation. You add water slowly, squishing the grain between your fingers, working it into a paste that feels more like wall plaster than anything edible. A bit of salt. A bit of oil. Possibly sesame. Possibly linseed. The tablet wasn't clear, and honestly, the oil jug was only labeled for cooking. The result? A grayish blob with the texture of wet sand. Now comes the shaping. You watch the others form perfect little pucks, pressing symbols into them with wooden stamps. Stars, suns, cuneiform symbols for luck or protection. You try your hand and produce something that looks vaguely like a terrified turtle. You tell yourself the gods will appreciate the effort. Some of the loaves will be used in religious offerings, while others will be distributed to temple workers or the poor. Historians still argue whether bread served as literal currency in temple economies or simply as a form of communal sustenance. Either way, this batch is going to see some serious traffic. You carry your loaves to the oven, which by now is a roaring dome of orange heat. The baker slaps each loaf against the inner wall, where it sticks like a stubborn thought. You watch the dough bubble, brown, and harden, the outer crust turning to stone while the inside softens just slightly. It's a kind of culinary alchemy. One curious tradition you learn about today is the bread whisper. Before baking, some cooks speak a short phrase to the dough, sometimes a prayer, sometimes a joke, sometimes nonsense words passed down from grandmothers who claimed the bread would rise better if it was flattered. You murmur something about your loaf being the most symmetrical one here. It's not true, but it does make you feel better. A fellow apprentice tells you about a recent discovery in an excavation near Nippur, a stone tablet with an entire poem dedicated to bread. Not gods, not kings, bread. You find that comforting. Maybe one day your own lumpy, slightly overcooked loaves will earn a verse or two. When the loaves come out, the baker taps one and listens to the hollow sound. It's a good thump. He hands it to you, and it's warm and dense in your hands. You take a bite and nearly break a tooth. It's dry, a little bitter, but with a nutty aftertaste that's oddly compelling. Like a story in food form, hard to chew, but worth finishing. As you sweep the flour off your apron, you notice the fading light catching on the carved recipe tablets lined up on a shelf. Some are chipped, others cracked, but the writing remains: take barley. Mix with oil. Bake until the gods smile. You wonder if your smile counts. The sky turns the color of diluted pomegranate juice, and with it comes the next course: pickled things. Babylonian palates, it turns out, were not limited to stews and breads. The ancients loved their briny, preserved delicacies almost as much as their gods. And tonight, you're in charge of the pickling station, or, as one cook calls it, the jars of quiet fermentation. You kneel beside rows of clay vessels sealed with beeswax and ash paste. Some are nearly as tall as your torso. Others are squat and round, like sleepy turtles. Inside, vegetables of various shapes, all suspended in mixtures that range from vinegary to suspiciously muddy. There's garlic, wild cucumber, perhaps even lotus root if the temple trade routes have been generous lately. You crack open one lid, and a sour, sharp tang rushes out, curling into your nostrils and prickling your eyes. It smells like something that died and got reincarnated as a condiment. You don't flinch. That's how you know you're improving. You fish out a sliver of pickled turnip using long bronze tongs, set it on a reed mat, and begin plating the preserved offerings for the ceremonial platter. A priest passes by and mutters an incantation. You nod, pretending you understand. The pickles are not just food, they're spiritual hygiene, symbolic of preservation, humility, and patience. Possibly also digestive aid. Who can say? Historians still argue whether the Babylonians pickled for flavor, health, or sheer necessity. In a city where heat withers everything by midday, fermentation may have been less choice than survival. But looking at the care with which each jar is labeled, with little wedge-shaped script noting the vegetable, brine mix, and intended season, it feels like a kind of culinary poetry. A senior cook explains that some jars are left to pickle for 3 full moons before being opened. Others are quick pickled, using a bath of date vinegar and salt water, and consumed within the week. Each has its own rhythm, its own quiet life. You take a small bite. The taste is electric, sharp, earthy, faintly floral. You feel your mouth puckering in confusion. The cook chuckles. It grows on you, he says. You're not sure whether he means the taste or the mold. Your next assignment is surprisingly delicate: flowers. In the shadow of all that barley, goat, and brine, Babylonian cuisine had a softer side, aromatic infusions made with petals, herbs, and blossoms brought in from temple gardens or merchant caravans. These weren't for eating, exactly. They were for steeping, smelling, and occasionally being floated in bowls during high feasts. Think of it as the original mood lighting. You follow an older assistant named Dogon to the herbarium, a shaded alcove near the temple courtyard. Here, rows of woven trays display dried saffron strands, chamomile blossoms, crushed rose petals, and a strange, curling vine called Eye of Ishtar. That last one may or may not be hallucinogenic. No one's entirely sure. It's mainly used to scent water jugs or infuse bath oil. You spend the afternoon selecting petals with tweezers made from reed strips. You sort them by color and potency. The trays smell like summer dreams, sweet, spicy, earthy, and slightly bitter. Dogon shows you how to crush the petals between your fingers and inhale slowly, until you feel your spine melt, he says. You laugh. He's not joking. You prepare a floral infusion for tonight's meal. Boiling water from a bronze kettle is poured over a muslin pouch filled with dried chamomile, rose, and a pinch of anise. The scent rises up like warm honey mixed with incense. The bowl is placed in the center of the feast table, meant to scent the air, not to drink. A priestess waves smoke over it, adding to the room's perfume. Historians still argue whether these infusions held ritual power or were simply part of upper-class indulgence. Some sources suggest they calmed the nerves before long ceremonies. Others hint they masked less appealing aromas, like wet goat or fermented lentil cakes. Either way, as you breathe in the delicate steam, you feel your heart slow a beat. You imagine noblewomen in linen robes doing the same centuries ago. Somewhere between scent and silence, this, more than the bread or broth, feels like a luxury. The feast is beginning now, but you're not sitting down. You're outside the temple courtyard, crouched by the fire pit, supervising the spit-roasted fish. It's not glamorous. It's not aromatic in a particularly charming way. But it's vital. Because in Babylon, a feast without fish was considered incomplete, especially if it came from the sacred canals. The fish today is river carp, huge, armored, and unfortunately, still twitching when it arrived. You helped clean it, scraping scales with a stone chip, stuffing the belly with a mix of fennel, crushed leek, and wild fig paste. Then it was secured on a wooden spit and set to rotate over a bed of glowing reeds and dung cakes. Elegant? Not really. Effective? Absolutely. As the fire roars, you listen to the flesh sizzle and pop, turning the spit slowly by hand. A senior cook watches your technique. Even cooking, he mutters, is a form of justice. You don't ask what he means. You just keep turning. An elderly priest stops by and tells you about a fragment of an old tablet found in the ruins of Uruk. It describes a royal fisherman named Namtaru who was buried with his favorite fish recipe etched into his tomb. The text includes a command, let no one ever forget the taste. You like the idea of that, being remembered for seasoning. Historians still argue whether fish was a daily staple or a luxury good. It likely depended on your proximity to water. Temples, of course, had better access to canal networks and controlled many fishing rights. You imagine some poor merchant upstream trying to sneak in a catfish without alerting the tax scribes. The skin crisps to golden. You brush it with date syrup near the end. A final touch you've learned from experience adds a beautiful glaze and a faint sweetness to balance the brine. A moment later, a young priest collects the spit and carries the fish off on a silver platter that looks too holy for something that once lived in mud. You wipe sweat from your brow. You smell like fish. But you feel victorious. Somewhere in that belly cavity, between the fig paste and fennel seeds, your effort is quietly preserved. You think the meal must be winding down now, but then a bell rings, sharp and silvery. That's your cue for dessert. Or at least the Babylonian version of it. There is no sugar, no chocolate, no pie crust here. But there are dates. Glorious, sticky, sun-soaked dates. And for tonight's feast, you're preparing mursu, a kind of sweet ball made from pounded dates, crushed nuts, and, if the temple is feeling generous, a touch of honey. You gather your tools, a shallow stone mortar, a reed spoon, and a cloth for drying your hands. The dates are soft and warm from being soaked in water for hours. You pit them by hand, your fingers turning syrupy brown. Then you mash them with the stone pestle until the paste is smooth and dark as polished wood. Next come the nuts. Probably pistachios. Possibly almonds. Historians still argue whether these were native to Mesopotamia or imported through trade with the Indus Valley. All you know is that they crunch beautifully and smell like toasted dreams. You fold the crushed nuts into the date paste, add a few drops of sesame oil, and roll the mixture into balls the size of quail eggs. Some will be dusted with dried flower petals. Others will be wrapped in fig leaves, tied with thread. Presentation matters, even when your guests are half asleep from stew and incense. A junior priest grins as he steals one from the tray. "Food of the gods," he says, and then promptly burns his tongue. You say nothing. He's new. You arrange the mursu on a wide, flat plate made of fired clay. There are tiny symbols etched into the rim, possibly blessings, possibly just someone's shopping list from 3 kings ago. You like to imagine a chef taking a break to jot down, "Don't forget cumin." As the tray is carried into the temple, you realize your hands are still sticky. You lick your thumb. It tastes like time. At this hour, the fire has quieted to coals, the shadows are long, and your task shifts to cleaning, not just tools, but knowledge. You're handed a damp cloth and a tablet. Not just any tablet. A recipe tablet. A real one, just like the chefs of long ago once carved with delicate styluses onto soft clay. You squint at the rows of cuneiform symbols, arranged like tiny bird tracks dancing across the surface. The head chef tells you it's time to add today's recipe to the archive, the mursu variation you helped craft. Your dessert will be immortalized, not in parchment or ink, but in fired earth. You sit cross-legged by the fire, stylus in hand, and practice carving neat little wedges into a raw slab of clay. The process is oddly soothing. A line for the base date paste. A second for the ratio of nuts. A note to add honey, only if harvest is good. And finally, the shape of the finished morsels, as round as a priest's belly, but sweeter. Historians still argue whether these culinary tablets were used by working cooks or were simply for ceremonial purposes. Some suggest they were teaching tools. Others believe they were status objects, a way to display one's kitchen mastery. What's undeniable is their odd permanence. A recipe from 3,800 years ago outlasted empires. As you work, you realize something. Cooking in Babylon isn't just about feeding people. It's about time travel. Every ladle of stew, every sticky date ball, every faint scorch mark is a conversation with ancestors. And now, your recipe, yes, your very own, will be baked into the clay and added to the temple archive. The priest thanks you. No applause. No fanfare. Just the quiet scrape of stylus against clay, and the knowledge that long after your fingerprints are dust, your sweets might still be remembered, your back aches, your arms are jelly, and yet, just as you begin to think your day is done, you're beckoned to the temple's inner chamber. You tiptoe across smooth stone floors, past flickering oil lamps, into a dim alcove where the senior scribes dine in whispered peace. This is where the real secrets live. Here, food isn't cooked, it's composed. You're shown a dish called tayu, which means something between porridge and ambrosia. It's a mixture of spelt grain, dried apricots, crushed chickpeas, and the very rare addition of sesame milk. You didn't even know sesame could be milked. Your job? Garnish. Specifically, shaving flakes of dried fish over the top of this warm, creamy porridge. It sounds odd, but the umami kick, combined with the sweetness of the apricots, somehow works. You ask why such strange combinations exist, and the answer is philosophical. In Babylon, balance was everything. Sweet and sour. Earthy and airy. Grain and sea. You're told even the gods appreciated a good flavor contrast. Historians still argue whether dishes like tayu were common fare or limited to temple elite. Some tablets mention them as food for festival days. Others note they were given to the sick. It's unclear. But what is clear is that this recipe, strange, warm, and oddly comforting, has endured longer than most. You take a bite from a leftover bowl. The texture is creamy, the flavors subtle and strange. The fish flake melts like smoke. You think, this is the opposite of modern food. Nothing screams. Nothing crunches. Everything whispers. The scribe nods and makes a note in a wax tablet. Good balance, he says. You're not sure if he means the dish or your quiet work. You simply bow and return to the flickering dark, your belly full and your brain steeped in sesame mist. Outside again, you find the night sky over Babylon to be impossibly vast. The stars seem organized, almost like a menu board written by a cosmic chef. As you stretch your sore arms, another cook waves you over. Time to salt the ox tongues, he says, far too cheerfully. You blink. You're not even sure you heard that right. But soon enough, you're kneeling beside a stone slab, where 3 sizable ox tongues, thick, rubbery, and alarmingly pink, rest like sleeping reptiles. These are delicacies for tomorrow's royal lunch, and your job is to prep them for overnight preservation. The method is simple but tedious. First, rub coarse salt and powdered coriander into every crevice, then wrap them in linen soaked in vinegar brine. You ask why tongues, of all things? The cook shrugs. Chewy, but flavorful. And they take spice as well. That may be the most Babylonian explanation of all. Historians still argue whether tongue was reserved for nobility or used more widely. The surviving tablets are vague. What is certain is that tongue appears often enough to suggest popularity, especially when flavored with beer-based sauces or roasted with onions. The tongue's texture reminds you of overcooked bread dough. Still, you work with care, layering spices like a sleepy sculptor. The salt draws out moisture. The linen holds it close. It's like mummification for meat. As you tie the final wrap, the cook offers you a joke. If it speaks to you, we overcooked it. You chuckle, a little too tired to argue. The tongues will be stored in a cool underground chamber tonight. Tomorrow, they'll be boiled, sliced, and served cold, perhaps with pickled leek, if there's any left. For now, they rest in their briny bandages like noble relics. You feel oddly proud. No one glamorizes ox tongue, but here in Babylon, even forgotten cuts have their moment on stone. The stars have shifted again. Time passes strangely in kitchens. You're now entrusted with the night shift, a quiet vigil beside the grain silos and ceramic ovens. A sleepy cook hands you a soft clay tablet with scribbles on it. Grain log, he yawns, before curling up on a sack of lentils. You blink. Is this your next job? Apparently so. Babylonian kitchens were powered by grain, emmer, barley, spelt, and those grains had to be tracked meticulously. A single feast could use several amphorae of flour. Every handful counted. You light a small oil lamp and begin checking inventory. You weigh sacks using a stone balance, note the amounts, and scratch symbols onto a wax slate that will later be transcribed onto permanent clay. You feel like a sleepy accountant with flour in their hair. The system is intricate. Each grain type has its own unit of measurement, its own assigned storage jar, even its own preferred ventilation method. You crack open one lid and find a preserved note, too damp. Mix with dry ash next time. It's signed with a symbol resembling a beetle. Perhaps a chef's signature. Historians still argue whether these logs were mostly practical or semi-sacred. After all, grain was currency, sacrifice, and sustenance rolled into one. Miscounting could mean famine or worse, embarrassing your temple's feast day. You run your fingers through the fine barley, cool and soft as sand. Each grain catches the light like tiny coins. You wonder how many hands it passed through before reaching your palms. Out here, where nothing sizzles and no one talks, you realize something comforting. The silence of grain is its own kind of wisdom. It waits. It listens. It feeds. And now, you're its careful steward. As dawn tiptoes toward the horizon, you find yourself stationed at the oven. Not the stew pots. Not the smoke pit. The oven. It's shaped like an upside-down funnel, mud-bricked and soot-stained. This is where bread lives and dies, and occasionally burns beyond recognition. A sleepy baker waves you over and points to a lump of dough. You'll know it's ready when it sings, he says. You hesitate. Dough doesn't sing. At least, not in your experience. Still, you need. The mixture is barley flour, water, and a pinch of wild yeast left fermenting overnight. It's tacky, sticky, and warm to the touch. As you work it into discs, you notice small bubbles forming, signs of life. You slide the first flatbread into the oven using a wooden paddle. It sticks to the inner wall and puffs up almost immediately, darkening from beige to gold to nearly black. You pull it out just before it scorches. It smells of toasted earth and faint sweetness. The baker leans over and listens. There's a faint crackling. There. It sings. Historians still argue whether Babylonian ovens were shared communal tools or guarded family secrets. Some were built into city walls. Others moved with traveling merchants. What's certain is that no meal went without bread. You make batch after batch. Some come out perfect. Others fall flat, literally. The trick, the baker explains, is humility. Bread isn't yours, he says. You just ask it to rise. By the time the sun crests the eastern rooftops, your arms are sore, your hands blistered, and your heart, oddly, light. You've helped bring the simplest thing to life, a humble disk of flour and fire. And somehow, that feels more eternal than gold. Your morning reward is not sleep. It's soup. You're ladling it now, thick, rich, and steaming, from a massive bronze cauldron, big enough to bathe a goat in. This is kashpu, a kind of breakfast stew made from lentils, bitter greens, and bone broth that simmered since midnight. It smells medicinal, but in a comforting, motherly sort of way. You dip in a reed ladle, stir counterclockwise, as is tradition, and serve it into small bowls for the temple staff. Each spoonful has to include at least one lentil, or someone will complain it's just flavored water. You make sure to ladle generously. A sleepy priest thanks you. This'll keep the demons out, he mumbles. You think he means hunger. Historians still argue whether morning stews like this were for health, ritual, or just stomach-filling convenience. Some say kashpu was believed to purify the body. Others suggest it was simply cheap and reliable. You taste it. The broth is deep. Salty, but not harsh. The greens are wilted and bitter, possibly chicory or wild arugula. The lentils are soft as size. It's not exciting, but it is enduring. A little like Babylon itself. Someone drops a bowl. The crash echoes, then fades. No one even looks up. That's how you know this is normal. You keep ladling, bowl after bowl. No grand finale. Just heat, comfort, and a spoonful of history that's easy on the teeth. The temple courtyard is bustling now. A new shipment of spices has arrived, tiny clay jars filled with strange powders, labeled with wedge-shaped script and tied with red thread. You're invited to assist in the inventory. It's not glamorous, but it smells incredible. You open the first jar. Cumin. Sharp, musky, slightly sweet. The second? Mustard seed. Then coriander, black pepper, dried garlic. One smells like crushed dreams and onion. Another reminds you of rain-soaked sandals. Spice is memory, distilled. The head chef joins you, holding a lump of what looks like dried mud. This, he says dramatically, is asafoetida. You sniff. It smells like sulfur and bad choices. He grins. Put just a pinch in a lamb stew, magic. Historians still argue whether Babylon imported most spices or cultivated more than we think. Evidence points both ways. Some spices likely came from India, Arabia, even Egypt. Others grew wild near the marshes and riverbanks. You weigh each jar, mark the contents, and carefully reseal them. The scribes insist that spice logs be precise. One mistake and someone's ceremonial stew could taste like soap. You pause at a small blue jar. Inside, dried rose petals ground to powder. You dip a fingerdip and taste. Sweet. Fragrant. Slightly bitter. Like nostalgia. Even here, among tiny jars and fragile labels, Babylon whispers, food is memory. And memory, well seasoned, lasts forever. You wander into a hushed chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, where the scent of frankincense competes with the savory aroma of bubbling barley stew. Tonight, you've been assigned to observe the night shift. Not the kind where sleepy chefs punch in and out of time clocks, but a Babylonian variation where apprentices, cooks, and sometimes entire temple kitchens operated deep into the cool darkness. It turns out, cooking didn't stop with the sun. The palace might slumber, but food kept moving, especially if a royal feast had to be ready by sunrise or a shipment of preserved goods had to be processed while the desert heat was at bay. You peer over the shoulder of a junior cook, watching him stir a steaming cauldron with a stick longer than he is tall. It's filled with a suspiciously thick porridge made of lentils, sheep's milk, and a dash of tamarisk ash, an old folk trick to give dishes a smoky aftertaste. You probably wouldn't order it twice, but hey, not your kitchen. Around you, someone is grinding chickpeas, another is plucking feathers from pigeons, and in the back corner, a sleepy baker is muttering lullabies to his dough. Apparently, Babylonian bakers genuinely believed singing to dough helped it rise. Historians still argue whether this was ritual, science, or just a side effect of working odd hours with too little sleep. At this hour, mistakes happen. You catch one apprentice accidentally grabbing the blue-glazed salt jar instead of the dried locusts. This is the third time tonight. The head chef just sighs, pinches the bridge of his nose, and scribbles something on a wax tablet, perhaps a passive-aggressive note for tomorrow's supervisor. Food preservation was a major concern, too. With the rivers rising and falling unpredictably, Babylonian chefs on the night shift often smoked meats or packed stews into clay pots sealed with river mud and beeswax. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Most of the time. Occasionally, a fermentation jar exploded, an event so common that kitchens were designed with small, sour rooms that could be sealed off when things got bubbly. You pass a storage alcove where the air smells faintly of dried dates and something sharper, garlic, maybe. In a corner, a young girl is inscribing a symbol into a soft clay tag that will be affixed to a jar. You squint at it. Is that a pictogram of a cow next to a sideways onion? You nod wisely, pretending to understand. She giggles. The night also had a strange way of changing food rituals. Without the priesthood's direct oversight, most temple officiants preferred daylight. Cooks sometimes whispered little prayers of their own. You hear one quietly murmur thanks to Ninkasi, goddess of beer, as he ladles out the last batch of a frothy, spiced barley brew. It's cloudy and warm, but thick with flavor and tradition. That's the thing, religion and recipes were inseparable here. Not always officially, of course. But once you've seen enough salt rings traced on tabletops or incense ash dropped into soup accidentally, you stop calling it coincidence. There's also a surprisingly lively betting pool over which dish will be accidentally oversalted and which apprentice will fall asleep on the grain sacks. This shift runs like a small city of its own, half factory, half family. Gossip is exchanged over trays of dried figs, and someone always has a cousin trying to get into the melon-smashing guild. Don't ask. Just nod again. By the time the moon reaches its highest point, the kitchens glow like underground lanterns. Not in brilliance, but in presence, quiet, consistent, humming with intention. While the rest of the city dreams, Babylon's food makers keep stirring, grinding, and sealing the flavors of a civilization that refuses to sleep on an empty stomach. You shuffle closer to the smoky hearth where a seasoned cook tends a large iron pot. It bubbles gently, sending out a comforting scent of spiced lamb and dried apricots. This is no ordinary stew, it's a Babylonian classic, slow-cooked overnight to soften tough cuts and infuse flavors. As you watch, the cook adds a pinch of asafoetida, a pungent resin that gives the dish a subtle bitterness, prized for its digestive benefits. You wrinkle your nose but remind yourself that taste buds were different back then, and honestly, who are you to judge a recipe that survived millennia? The kitchen's walls are thick with soot, a testament to years of firewood and the occasional burst of flame when impatient cooks forgot to adjust their embers. There's a worn clay tablet perched nearby, inscribed with a recipe you can barely decipher, a mix of cuneiform and doodles. It said that Babylonian chefs were some of the first to write down cooking instructions, turning food into a kind of literature. This practice probably saved a few royal banquets from disaster, especially when the head chef was out hunting or indulging in one of his famous naps. Between stirring and seasoning, the cook shares a curious tale. Apparently, in some households, bread was baked only once a week, then stored carefully in cool, dry places. This was partly out of necessity, wood was precious, but also because the bread was dense and lasted longer than you might expect. It was the daily equivalent of fast food, just without the fries or drive-through. Historians still argue whether this weekly baking habit was widespread or mainly a temple kitchen luxury. Nearby, you spot a group of apprentices nervously testing their knife skills on onions and dates, their fingers moving hesitantly. One mutters a prayer to Marduk, hoping to avoid a finger mishap. Given the dim light and their fatigue, you can't blame them. A minor cut could easily spoil the whole night's rhythm. As the night deepens, the kitchen's energy slows to a gentle lull. Conversations turn quieter, steps softer. The constant clatter of pots and pans is replaced by the occasional sigh and the distant hum of the Euphrates flowing nearby. Somewhere, a dog barks, probably dreaming of scraps. You realize that while these kitchens buzzed with activity, there was a comforting steadiness to it all, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of ancient Babylon itself. The soft glow of the firelight reveals rows of clay jars lined against the walls, each sealed meticulously with mud and wax. You move closer, curious about their contents. Here lie preserved treasures, dates soaked in honey, pickled cucumbers, and even smoked fish wrapped in palm leaves. Preservation was both art and necessity. The Babylonian climate, with its hot days and cool nights, demanded clever methods to keep food edible beyond the brief growing seasons. One method you find particularly charming is ash baking. Instead of ovens, some cooks buried dough in warm ashes overnight. The slow, indirect heat created a crusty loaf with a smoky aroma, somewhat like a campfire bread. You wonder how many guests ever asked, "What's that funny taste?" and received a knowing smile in reply. As you examine the labels on the jars, you notice a strange symbol, a crescent moon with a tiny fish inside. Your companion explains this marks seafood dishes, which were a delicacy for those who lived close enough to the Tigris and Euphrates to enjoy fresh catch. Fish recipes were often considered a secret art, passed down in whispers. Historians still debate how far these recipes traveled beyond Babylon's borders, perhaps influencing neighboring cultures. While the kitchen staff sleep in shifts, some tasks require constant attention. Fermentation, for example, was tricky business. The bubbling pots of beer and sourdough demanded a watchful eye. Too little or too much heat could ruin the batch. A ruined fermentation meant wasted barley, which was as good as losing gold in those times. You can't help but admire the multitasking prowess of these ancient chefs, managing ingredients, fires, rituals, and sometimes even medical advice. After all, food was often prescribed as medicine. That sticky date syrup? A cure for coughs. Lentil stew? Good for digestion. Mixing meals with healing was standard, and you're left wondering if any of your own favorite comfort foods have ancient Babylonian roots. In the dim light, you notice a peculiar object resting on a low shelf, a small, carved wooden box with delicate hinges. Opening it reveals tiny, flattened tablets covered in cuneiform script. These are personal recipe notes, jotted down by individual cooks, sometimes in code or shorthand only they understood. The fact that recipes were personalized hints at a surprising level of culinary individuality in a society often thought of as rigid and formal. You overhear a debate among the kitchen apprentices about the origins of one famous dish, a sweet, spiced pudding made from dates and barley. Some claim it was first concocted by temple chefs to honor the goddess Inanna, while others argue it was a street vendor's clever invention to sell treats during market days. Historians still debate whether these recipes were exclusively sacred or simply adapted from everyday street food. This sparks a realization: Babylonian cuisine was a mosaic, blending temple traditions with popular tastes, royal banquets with humble meals. You imagine yourself wandering a bustling market by day, the air thick with scents of cumin, garlic, and fresh bread, and by night, witnessing the transformation of these raw ingredients into elaborate dishes. The night cook swaps stories, some true, some exaggerated, about the origins of their favorite meals. One claims a recipe was inspired by a dream, another swears it came from a visiting trader who brought exotic spices from the east. You listen carefully. After all, who's to say dreams and chance encounters didn't shape Babylonian cooking as much as formal training? As the night progresses, you feel a strange kinship with these ancient chefs, their perseverance and creativity echoing in your own kitchen rituals. The night may be quiet outside, but here, in the warm, fragrant heart of Babylon's kitchens, life simmers on. The crackling fire casts long shadows on the walls, revealing an array of cooking tools: clay pots, bronze knives, wooden spoons, and reed baskets. You run your fingers over a smooth, shallow bowl designed for serving, marveling at the craftsmanship. Tools weren't just functional, they were often inscribed or decorated, turning everyday objects into miniature works of art. One cook tells you about the flavor stones they used, small pieces of baked clay infused with herbs, dropped into stews to enhance aroma and taste. The idea sounds strange, but apparently, these stones absorbed and released flavors slowly, acting like primitive seasoning pods. You smile at the thought, imagining a Babylonian version of a tea bag in your stew. Food preparation was also a social event. Apprentices learned by watching and mimicking, often in noisy, bustling rooms filled with chatter, laughter, and the occasional reprimand. Senior chefs sometimes held impromptu lessons, emphasizing the balance between spices and the sacred timing of rituals. Historians still argue whether these informal kitchens functioned more like schools or tight-knit families. You watch as a cook carefully grinds coriander seeds on a stone mortar, their rhythm almost meditative. The aroma fills the air, blending with the scent of roasting meat and fresh herbs. It's a sensory symphony that you wish you could bottle and take home. The night wears on, and despite the long hours, there's an underlying sense of pride and purpose. These kitchens weren't just places to make food, they were centers of culture, innovation, and continuity. Each meal carried stories, beliefs, and the hopes of a civilization reaching across time. A gentle breeze slips through a small window, carrying with it the faint sounds of the city's nighttime lull. You lean against a wooden table, feeling the warmth of the fire seep into your bones. Nearby, a cook carefully folds thin sheets of unleavened bread, preparing them for tomorrow's breakfast. It's a simple task, but one imbued with ritual significance. Bread was central to Babylonian meals, a constant companion whether for royalty or commoners. You learn that some breads were sweetened with date syrup, while others were mixed with herbs or seeds to add texture and flavor. The variety is staggering, especially considering the limited ingredients available. There's an odd little tradition you find endearing. Bakers often mark their loaves with unique stamps, sometimes geometric shapes, sometimes tiny animals. These marks identified the baker or the intended recipient, sort of like ancient food branding. You imagine a modern-day baker stamping loaves with smiley faces or emoji. Historians still argue whether these marks served mainly commercial purposes or had a ritual role as well. You watch the baker carefully press a reed stamp into the dough, leaving a delicate imprint. It's a reminder that even the simplest food held meaning and identity. As the dough rises by the firelight, you feel a peaceful connection to these hands that worked centuries ago, crafting nourishment and culture simultaneously. Outside, the city rests, but here, the kitchen remains a quiet, lively world, a place where food and history mingle softly in the shadows. The kitchen's smoky air carries a new scent, rich sesame oil warming gently in a shallow pan. You watch as a cook carefully tosses chunks of meat, letting them brown slowly. Babylonian chefs prized sesame oil not just for flavor but for its long shelf life, a godsend in the warm Mesopotamian climate. They even used it in lamps and cosmetics, proving its versatility beyond the kitchen. An apprentice mentions a curious custom: before cooking certain dishes, they would whisper blessings to the oil, hoping to infuse the meal with divine favor. You smile at the thought. Modern chefs might be surprised to find spirituality paired so closely with their sauté pans. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, and whether it was limited to temple kitchens or common households. As the meat sizzles, the cook sprinkles in ground cumin and garlic, transforming the smell into something mouth-watering. You realize that while many spices seem familiar today, their introduction to Babylon was part of an evolving trade network stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. A small story circulates among the staff. A merchant once tried to smuggle exotic spices past customs, hiding them in sacks of barley. The plan failed spectacularly when a guard sniffed the barrels, instantly recognizing the valuable aromas. It's a reminder that food and politics were often intertwined, with spices serving as both luxury and power symbols. You lean back, savoring the aroma as it drifts through the kitchen, and wonder how many of these flavors have traveled into your own meals, centuries later. You move to a quieter corner where the preparation of medicinal foods is underway. Babylonian cooks often doubled as healers, mixing ingredients not just to satisfy hunger but to cure ailments. You watch as a mixture of lentils, honey, and herbs is carefully stirred in a small clay bowl. This humble concoction was believed to soothe stomach troubles and strengthen the body. One cook points out a tablet listing dozens of such recipes, blurring the lines between kitchen and clinic. This dual role sometimes led to heated debates among scholars. Were cooks truly the first pharmacists, or did medicine belong solely to the priests and physicians? Historians still argue whether these culinary remedies were scientifically effective or largely symbolic. The atmosphere here feels more reverent, less chaotic. You notice an elderly woman carefully crushing dried poppy seeds, a practice thought to relieve pain and induce calm. While you're tempted to question the safety of some ingredients, you remind yourself that medical knowledge was evolving, often through trial and error. The idea of food as medicine resonates deeply. You think about your own late-night snacks, perhaps less medicinal but equally comforting. It's oddly reassuring to realize that the ancient Babylonians shared this intuitive understanding, long before modern science caught up. A whispered joke circulates that a bad cook might accidentally cure an illness just by making the patient too wary to eat their food again, a gentle reminder that even culinary mishaps had their place in the grand scheme. Your attention turns to a large, elaborately decorated clay tablet resting on a pedestal. This is a royal recipe, painstakingly carved and designed to impress. The script details a lavish feast including roasted goose stuffed with dates and a sweet sauce made from fermented grape juice. It's clear that food was a status symbol, a way for kings and nobles to display wealth and power. You imagine the palace kitchens bustling with dozens of cooks, each responsible for a specific dish or technique. The pressure to please a royal palate must have been immense. One wrong spice or burnt crust could lead to disaster. Historians still debate how much creative freedom chefs enjoyed versus strict adherence to royal menus. An intriguing rumor floats through the staff. The king once hosted a banquet so extravagant that guests were served food on plates made of thinly sliced gold leaf. Whether true or exaggerated, it captures the luxurious extremes of Babylonian dining culture. You spot a small figure in the corner, likely a food taster whose job was to ensure no poison spoiled the festivities, a dangerous but prestigious role. This practice underscores the politics simmering beneath every meal, where food was both pleasure and potential peril. As the evening deepens, the grandiosity of palace dining contrasts sharply with the modest meals outside these walls, yet both share the same heartbeat, the timeless human ritual of breaking bread together. Outside the palace, you find yourself in a bustling market where spices, grains, and fresh produce are displayed in vibrant piles. The vendors' calls mingle with the clatter of carts and chatter of shoppers. Food here is raw and immediate, ingredients waiting to be transformed by skilled hands into the dishes you've been smelling all night. A vendor proudly displays a rare delicacy, wild garlic harvested from nearby marshes. It's prized for its pungent flavor and believed to have medicinal properties. You buy a small bunch, curious how its sharpness will be softened in the kitchens later. You note that wild plants and herbs were a crucial part of the Babylonian diet, supplementing cultivated crops. Market gossip flows alongside food talk. You overhear a discussion about the latest import from distant lands, a spice that smells like cinnamon but with a bitter twist. Its arrival caused a stir among chefs eager to experiment. Historians still debate whether this spice was kasha or something entirely different, but its introduction marks a moment of culinary expansion. The market is also a social hub, where cooks exchange tips, recipes, and sometimes a bit of friendly rivalry. You spot a few familiar faces from the kitchens you visited earlier, carrying baskets laden with fresh ingredients, ready to return to their workstations. As the sun sets, the market's energy slowly winds down, leaving behind traces of scent and the promise of tomorrow's meals. Back in the kitchens, you witness the art of fermentation, an ancient practice that added depth and preservation to Babylonian food. Large earthenware jars bubble quietly with fermenting barley beer, a staple enjoyed by all classes. The brewing process was complex, involving multiple stages and careful timing, often guided by lunar cycles. You learn that beer wasn't just a beverage but a form of currency and social glue. Workers were sometimes paid in beer rations, highlighting its central role in daily life. A cook laughs softly, recalling a saying that an empty cup was a sad sight indeed. Historians still debate the exact ingredients and brewing methods, as records are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Nearby, pots of fermented sourdough rise slowly by the firelight. The tangy bread was a favorite breakfast item, its robust flavor complementing rich stews and sweet date syrups. You marvel at how fermentation techniques shaped the Babylonian palate long before microbiology was a thing. A playful apprentice compares the fermentation jars to ancient science experiments gone deliciously right. You chuckle, imagining these brewers as the original mad scientists, their bubbling concoctions filling the night with both scent and mystery. As the night deepens, you feel the hum of ancient innovation alive in these bubbling vessels, a gentle reminder that food is always evolving. Even in the quiet hours, you move toward a low table where delicate desserts are being prepared. Babylonian sweets were often based on dates, honey, and nuts, combined into sticky, fragrant treats. One cook skillfully crushes pistachios to sprinkle atop a layered pudding, its creamy texture a contrast to the crunchy topping. Sweet dishes were reserved for special occasions, though some households enjoyed small treats regularly. You note that sugar as we know it wasn't available, so natural sweeteners ruled the day. The combination of flavors and textures was carefully balanced to delight but not overwhelm. A small tablet nearby lists a recipe for a honey cake, dense and rich, often served during festivals. You smile at the idea of ancient birthday cakes, imagining joyous celebrations with family and friends, much like today. Historians still argue whether these sweets were primarily temple offerings or everyday indulgences. The sacred and the mundane often overlapped, blurring the lines between religious ritual and simple pleasure. As the cook folds the final layer of pudding, you notice the quiet satisfaction on her face. The act of creating sweetness, no matter how small, seems to bring comfort across the centuries, you wander over to a corner where large clay pots store preserved fruits soaked in spiced syrups. The colors are deep and inviting, figs, pomegranates, and apricots glistening in amber hues. These preserves were a luxury, crafted carefully to enjoy months after harvest. The preservation process was both practical and artistic. You learn that cooks used natural fermentation and honey to seal in flavor, creating textures that ranged from chewy to syrupy. These sweet jars were prized gifts and often exchanged during festivals or diplomatic visits. A gentle debate arises among the cooks about the best preservation techniques. Some swear by the slow, cold curing in stone cellars, while others prefer quick soaking in warm honey baths. Historians still debate which method was more common or considered superior. You reflect on how these preserved fruits represent a clever way to hold on to summer's bounty through the harsh Babylonian winters. It's a lesson in patience and resourcefulness that feels surprisingly modern. As you sip a small taste of syrup, its sweetness lingers warmly on your tongue, a final indulgence before the kitchen settles into quiet rest. Now the kitchen has grown quiet, and most of the cooks have gone home or curled into corners for a bit of rest. But a few remain, those who work the night shift, tending the slow-cooking dishes that need hours to transform. You sit by a glowing hearth where a clay pot simmers gently, its lid weighted with a stone to keep it sealed. Inside is a stew that's been cooking since sundown, meat, legumes, and spices stewing into something rich and unforgettable. This long cooking method wasn't just for flavor, it was born of necessity. With fuel expensive and fire hard to maintain, the Babylonians mastered the art of residual heat. They'd bury pots in hot ash or embers and let them sit overnight. Historians still debate whether these slow methods began in rural households or temple kitchens, but the technique spread widely through all levels of society. The night cook, older and quieter than the others, tells you a tale passed down in his family, of a stew so perfect, it made a visiting dignitary weep. Was it true? Perhaps. Or maybe it was just a way to explain why one should never rush a meal. You nod, because in this place, truth doesn't always have to be verifiable, it only has to feel possible. The cook adds a small pinch of dried mint to the pot, stirring slowly with a flat wooden spoon carved with a crescent moon. You ask about the design, and he shrugs, saying it brings good luck to night meals. Historians might scoff, but deep down, you hope it's true. Outside, you can hear the sounds of the city settling, dogs barking in the distance, a breeze rustling reeds by the river, and the occasional laugh from a guard on patrol. But inside, the kitchen is a world apart, its steady heat and drowsy rhythms carrying you gently forward. You take a seat near the hearth, the warmth seeping into your bones, and realize, there's something timeless about this moment. People have always sat beside fires, waiting for food and stories, hoping that both will fill them up just right. By now, you've slipped into the easy rhythm of the kitchen. Even the clatter of bronze ladles and the hiss of oil no longer feel jarring, they're part of a low and steady lullaby. The scribes have finished their tablets for the evening and placed them on a high shelf to dry, still warm from the hand that pressed each careful wedge. But then, an odd request. A temple assistant shuffles in, looking sheepish. He's holding a baby goat, freshly slaughtered, and asks if anyone can make the black garlic and date reduction that his high priest insists upon during moon vigils. The cook nods without surprise. Apparently, this is a recurring order. You watch as he starts the process, garlic roasted until blackened, crushed with fermented date syrup and thinned with a splash of date wine. The result is an inky sauce so rich it smells like earth and fire. It's smeared in careful strokes over the meat, which will be grilled on a slab of basalt, volcanic stone that retains heat in a way that metal cannot. There's debate among scholars whether this sauce was truly used in temples or only in aristocratic homes, but the recipe turns up more than once, always with slight variations, more wine here, an extra clove of garlic there. It's a reminder that taste, like belief, evolves with the one who's holding the spoon. The temple assistant stays to watch, his hands clasped behind his back. He looks equal parts hungry and reverent. After all, this sauce isn't just a condiment, it's part of a sacred rite. And yet, the cook stirs it like he's done it 100 times, which, you suspect, he has. You lean in closer, the tang of sweet, sour, and umami curling into your nose, and wonder if recipes like this survive because they taste divine, or because we keep telling ourselves they must. You're watching the night kitchen thin out. A few sleepy-eyed apprentices have curled up beside baskets of onions, their heads resting on woven sacks of barley. The fire is dimmer now, down to glowing coals and the occasional flicker of yellow. And just when you think things are settling, someone drags in a peculiar object, something you hadn't expected to see in a place like this. A clay oven shaped like a turtle. The baker, a wiry man with soot-streaked forearms and a permanent squint, explains with a shrug that this is the bread tortoise, used only for a certain kind of ritual loaf. Not a daily staple. Not a temple offering. Something in between. It's made once a month on the third night of the new moon, filled with lentil mash, honey, and a dusting of ground pistachio. The recipe for the tortoise loaf is carved, yes, carved, into the inside rim of the oven shell, in tight, neat cuneiform. You kneel to see it and feel a slight thrill. There it is, a literal recipe carved into the tools of the trade, baked into the workflow. Historians still puzzle over whether this was meant for practicality or prestige. But in the glow of firelight, the answer feels irrelevant. It's just beautiful. The baker begins to shape the dough, thick and sticky, fragrant with coriander, and presses it into the tortoise mold. He then sets a clay lid on top and places the whole thing over embers, not in them. A slow roast, he explains, to keep the honey from burning. As you sit and watch it bake, you notice the other kitchen workers glancing over from time to time. This bread isn't everyday fare. It's special, not for its ingredients, but because it reminds everyone here that food can also be storytelling, symbolism, even a bit of superstition. When the bread is finally lifted from the mold, it smells like warm sugar and spice and something older than memory. The baker breaks a corner for you, grinning. It's chewy, nutty, softly sweet. Like a lullaby for your mouth, the tortoise oven still radiates gentle heat as you move away, your fingers sticky with honey and crushed pistachio. You return to the back of the kitchen, where jars line the walls like sleepy sentinels, rows and rows of tightly sealed clay vessels, each labeled with neat little incisions. These are the spice archives, or so the cooks jokingly call them. You kneel by one and trace your fingers across the script. Saffron, imported from far east of Elam. Another says cassia. Another, intriguingly, simply reads, dry river plant, bitter. Not every ingredient was well understood, even by the people who used them. Some were passed down by tradition, others by superstition. A junior scribe enters, carrying a wax tablet smudged with oil and flour. He's not here to cook. He's here to catalog the jars. Apparently, every new batch of imported goods is tracked by weight, vendor, and, oddly enough, color. The Babylonians were fascinated by pigment. A spice's hue could hint at freshness, purity, or even moral alignment. Historians still debate whether color-based sorting systems served practical or ceremonial purposes, or both. The scribe lifts a jar of ground turmeric and holds it to the lamplight, scribbling notes as the powder glows golden. You wonder if he's really thinking about pigment, or dinner. One of the older cooks joins you and points to a sealed jar in the back. That one's the good stuff, he whispers. You raise an eyebrow. It's just salt. He shakes his head. Not just salt. River salt. From a spring that only flows 2 weeks a year. Blessed by priests. Or cursed by ghosts. Depends who you ask. You can't tell if he's joking. Neither can he. You taste a pinch. It's salty. Still, the idea lingers, that ingredients weren't just functional. They were characters in a story, symbols in a mythic recipe. The kitchen wasn't just a workplace, it was a shrine, a school, and a theater, the spice archive fades into the background as you follow a faint trail of laughter and steam toward a small annex you hadn't noticed before. It's a fermentation nook, warmer, earthier, thick with the smell of yeast and sweet decay. Inside, rows of ceramic crocks bubble quietly, some covered with tightly stretched cloth, others sealed with beeswax and twine. One of the apprentices is tending to a large jar labeled soured barley mash, and she explains with a sleepy grin that this will become a kind of proto-beer. Not for getting drunk, she says, for breakfast. And that's not a joke. Babylonians drank weak, grainy beer as a daily staple, often flavored with herbs, dates, or bits of sour bread. A whole breakfast you could sip. Near the back, another vessel is crusted with dried fig residue. The apprentice opens it proudly to reveal a deep purple jam, fermented, tart, and lightly spiced with clove. A spoonful is passed around on a flat shard of fired clay, still warm from the bread oven. The combination is shockingly good. You lick your lips, surprised. Everyone does, she shrugs. The recipes for these fermentation projects weren't always written down. Some were encoded in metaphor, in riddles like, let the moon dance thrice before tasting, or, when the figs argue with the barley, it is ready. Historians still argue whether these were poetic guides or veiled instructions for timing. Either way, it adds to the dreamy logic of the place. Fermentation, like sleep, is about letting time do the work. And the Babylonians understood this intuitively. To cook was to wait. To wait was to trust. Trust the mash to bubble, the jam to thicken, the sourness to balance itself out. You don't rush a thing like this. You just let it become what it's meant to be. Someone yawns. Another apprentice dozes off beside a vat of honeyed yogurt, his head propped on a pillow made of folded linen. The bubbling continues, steady as breath. Even the crocks seem to exhale. And so do you. The sky is still dark outside the narrow kitchen windows, but something shifts in the air, an invisible cue that morning is creeping closer. The cookhouse begins its quiet pivot from night to day. The next phase? Prep for the palace staff's breakfast. But you're not headed there just yet. You're led instead to a quiet chamber just beyond the fermentation nook, where a single oil lamp flickers beside a flat table. On the surface is something unexpected, an enormous clay tablet etched with intricate symbols. This is no recipe. It's a training guide. You squint to read. The first line is oddly familiar, a good cook listens before he stirs. It's part proverb, part procedure manual, filled with poetic rules and mnemonic devices, designed not just to teach, but to be remembered, recited, even whispered. A head chef enters, stoop-backed and robe-sleeved, and begins to murmur the tablet aloud. Cut the garlic after bread is baked, never before. Smells offend the honey spirit. You stifle a laugh, but he doesn't. This is serious to him. Rituals mattered. Not always for logic's sake, but because memory is built on rhythm and repetition. It's easier to remember, don't offend the honey spirit, than, keep your flavors balanced. The tablet includes symbols that look like measuring spoons, except some are fish-shaped, others crescent moons. Scholars still debate whether these symbols refer to quantities, tools, or something more symbolic. Could 2 fish mean an amount? A time of day? A nod to a festival? You run your hand across the ridges of the script and feel the subtle grooves, like braille for the sleepy mind. These weren't mass-printed instructions. Each clay lesson was impressed by hand, baked in fire, and passed down through finger memory. A cookbook that could survive a 1,000-year flood, the old chef invites you to sit while he smooths out a blank clay slab beside the ancient tablet. A junior apprentice arrives with a stylus, just a thin reed cut to a point. And you realize, you're about to witness the creation of a recipe, not just its use. He begins slowly, first carving a soft header, for a morning dish of wheat and date. It's not a title, it's a promise. Then, like someone playing an instrument he's practiced all his life, he presses the stylus into the clay, line by deliberate line. No flourishes. No wasted motion. First, the measurements: a third of the barley loaf, juice of one early fig, a finger-length of clarified butter. The units are whimsical, and not at all standardized. Finger length depends on whose finger. Early fig depends on your judgment. This isn't chemistry. It's choreography. Next comes a set of actions: mash the grain while humming. Fold the date in silence. Wait, what? You glance at the chef, but he's dead serious. Humming? Silence? Apparently, some recipes instructed mood or even volume as part of their preparation. Historians still debate whether this was spiritual, symbolic, or just another clever way to remember sequences. The last part is a sketch: 3 parallel lines, then a squiggle, then a crescent. Garnish, let rest, and serve before the shadow crosses the second line, the chef murmurs. That's their version of timing. Not minutes or hours, but shadows. You imagine being timed not by a clock, but by the sun's sleepy angle on a stone wall. When he's done, he hands the tablet to the apprentice, who carefully sets it in a low-temperature clay oven to bake it dry. It will join the shelf of permanent recipes, where it might stay for 100 years, or more. Your eyes follow the faint wisps of smoke curling up from the kiln, curling like scent itself, and you wonder how many cooks it will lull to sleep someday. By now, the kitchens are beginning to hum with waking life. Not loud, just a soft chorus, shuffles of sandals, the occasional yawn, a rhythmic tapping as knives meet chopping boards made of lacquered wood. But the story doesn't speed up. It stretches, like dough under a sleepy palm. You find yourself drawn toward the bread station, where a trio of women in soot-dusted robes are kneading dough with the kind of unthinking grace that only comes from years of repetition. The flour dust floats like incense, and the heat from the ovens radiates in soft pulses, like the coals are breathing. They're making flatbreads, of course, but not just one kind. There's the simple barley round, good for wrapping dried fruits. There's the sesame seed-crusted triangle, reserved for offerings. And there's one particularly ornate, spiral-shaped loaf smeared with fig paste and twisted so intricately it looks like a pastry. That one is for weddings, or, depending on the mood, funerals. One of the bakers smiles as she shapes another coil. Same dough. Different day, she says. Only the folding changes. It sounds like kitchen wisdom, but it's more than that. Every Babylonian bread carried its own social signal. Some were offerings to gods, some were symbols of status, and some, like the crisscrossed double-ring loaf, were only ever made for newborns. You mess up the shape, and you risk offense, not just to the eater, but to the ritual itself. Historians still argue whether the loaves were coded language, culinary telegrams sent across tables and temples. If so, imagine what a feast must have felt like, a language of textures, crusts, colors, and shapes. You wouldn't need a single spoken word to say, "This is a prayer," or "We grieve with you," or "The groom still has all his teeth." It makes you look differently at bread, doesn't it? Not just as food, but as soft-baked communication. You breathe in. It smells like flour, ashes, and sweetness. The spiral loaf is done. And you're just drowsy enough to believe it's smiling back at you. You wander away from the warm scent of baking bread, following a corridor that winds past the rinsing stations and herb sorting tables, until you find yourself in a quieter part of the kitchen complex, cooler, darker, and hushed like a library. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. Rows of clay tablets are neatly stacked on low shelves, each one slightly curved from the drying process, their corners smoothed by generations of handling. Some are etched with long, poetic recipe sequences. Others look more like notes, corrections, or even critiques. A kind of editorial department for Babylonian cuisine. A young scribe sits at a table near the back, stylus in hand, gently tracing over an older tablet. Not copying it, just retracing the fading lines to keep them legible. It's not just chefs who preserve recipes here. Scribes, too, carry the torch. Or in this case, the reed. He glances up and nods toward a particularly cracked and brittle-looking tablet displayed beneath a thin cloth. That one's our oldest, he whispers. Dated to the reign of Hammurabi, maybe earlier. You peer closer and make out a faint list: sheep's stomach, leeks, fermented milk, coriander. Sounds rich. Maybe even unpleasant. But it's history. It smells like time. The scribe adds, we don't cook from it anymore. Too sacred. Or too dangerous. Depends who you ask. He grins. This little room isn't for eating. It's for remembering. Recipes here aren't just food instructions. They're lineage, language, legacy. You find tablets with greasy fingerprints embedded in the clay, as if the writer had paused to wipe a hand mid-stir. Some even have tiny side notes etched in the corner: don't skimp on salt, or tried with lamb. Disaster. Historians still debate whether this archive was meant to be public, like a shared cookbook, or private, used only by temple cooks or noble kitchens. But there's something about the quiet pride in this room that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a secret. A soft-spoken, spice-scented secret. And somewhere in the back, a pigeon coos lazily, as if to say, you're welcome to stay. You slip out of the archive with the quiet care of someone leaving a sacred chamber, and step back into the heart of the kitchen, where something has shifted. The morning light now slices across the flagstones in long, golden streaks, and the pace has picked up, only slightly, but enough to feel like everyone's had their first cup of date honey tea. In a corner near the fire pits, a curious scene unfolds. A cook and a musician are arguing over lentils. You blink, wondering if your sleepiness has invented this tableau. But no, it's real. The cook holds a steaming bowl and gestures emphatically with a carved wooden spoon. The musician, robes dusted with lyre string lint, shakes his head. Too bitter, he says. It fights the tone. What tone? You ask yourself. Then you see, they're preparing for a dinner performance, and apparently, even the food must harmonize with the music. You sidle closer, and overhear their peculiar logic. Lentils are heavy and grounding, perfect for a low, droning reed flute. But if they're paired with a zesty fish sauce, they clash with the higher-pitched lyre. You glance at the bubbling pot and wonder what kind of menu sounds like an E-flat minor. Historians still argue whether this practice, pairing food with music, was symbolic, superstitious, or a genuine part of royal banquets. There are fragments of Babylonian texts that describe menus as composed, and some dishes are annotated with, to accompany the drum. You start to realize, these kitchens weren't just about feeding the body. They were about staging a sensory symphony. The cook finally concedes and stirs in a spoonful of crushed date to soften the bitterness. The musician nods approvingly, plucks a string, and declares, now it's a song. The cook rolls her eyes but smiles anyway. You wonder what your favorite dish would sound like if someone tried to set it to music. Maybe macaroni and cheese is a slow waltz. Maybe pickles are a kazoo solo. The lentils are served in bowls shaped like flower petals, another little nod to harmony. You don't taste it, but you feel it. And your ears are just as full as your imagination. The kitchen noise fades as you move toward the quieter courtyard garden where herbs and vegetables grow in neat rows, watered by gentle irrigation channels. The air here is cooler and tinged with the sharp fragrance of fresh coriander, mint, and dill. You kneel to touch the soil, which is surprisingly soft beneath your fingers, carrying a faint, earthy promise. Here, the ancient chefs didn't just hunt or trade for ingredients, they cultivated a living pantry. You notice small labels etched on stone markers beside the plants, written in cuneiform script, detailing planting times, harvest methods, and even preferred soil conditions. These early agricultural manuals hint at an early science of flavor. You reach for a sprig of hyssop, inhaling its warm, slightly bitter aroma. This herb was prized not only for cooking but also for its medicinal properties. Chefs and healers often overlapped roles, blending remedies and recipes in ways modern minds still struggle to separate. Historians still debate how much knowledge about herbs was practical versus ritualistic, and whether the gardens doubled as sacred spaces for spiritual cleansing alongside food production. The blending of the culinary and the sacred is one of Babylon's quiet mysteries. A gardener nearby hums a low tune as he prunes the basil, and you wonder if it's the same tune the cooks were debating with their lentils earlier. Somehow, it feels like all these little details, herbs, sounds, shapes, are threads in the same soft tapestry. You gather a few leaves, letting their scents mingle in your hand. The garden seems to breathe, slow and steady, as if coaxing you to breathe with it. And for a moment, you feel rooted too. Your footsteps lead you back inside, where a collection of large earthenware jars dominate a dimly lit corner. You recognize these immediately. They are the fermenting vats. This is where milk turns to yogurt, barley becomes beer, and mysterious sauces bubble in secrecy. The air here is tangy, a complex bouquet of sour, yeasty, and smoky aromas. One jar is labeled herbatu, a fermented fish sauce that historians still argue was the Babylonian equivalent of ketchup or soy sauce, ubiquitous, flavorful, and probably pungent enough to clear a room. A wizened cook dips a ladle into a jar and offers you a cautious sip. It's salty and sharp, but oddly comforting, like a culinary handshake across millennia. She smiles and says, "This keeps longer than gossip." A good kitchen joke, even in ancient times. Fermentation was both an art and a necessity. Without refrigeration, fermenting extended shelf life and unlocked new flavors. And the jars themselves were sometimes sealed with bitumen, a sticky black tar, to keep the magic inside. You imagine the patience it took to wait for a batch to mature, the subtle adjustments of temperature and time. Historians debate how controlled these processes were. Were they guided by strict recipes or passed down instincts? Probably a bit of both. As you sip, you wonder what it would have been like to be the keeper of these bubbling vats. A guardian of tastes that could delight or disappoint an entire feast. Emerging from the fermenting room, you step into a quiet hallway lined with shelves of clay jars, each carefully labeled with the contents: dried dates, pounded cumin, powdered cinnamon, and even ground lapis lazuli, a mineral prized for its vibrant blue pigment, sometimes used in food decoration or ceremonial dishes. You pause at a jar marked simsum or sesame seeds, which were both a cooking staple and a source of oil. The seeds shimmer in the low light like tiny golden suns, promising richness and texture. The cook here explains how sesame oil was used not only for frying but also as a preservative and even a beauty product. Imagine, your salad dressing and your moisturizer could come from the same source. Efficiency at its finest. Nearby, a child apprentice balances a tall jar of saffron, the prized red stigmas carefully protected from dust and moisture. This precious spice was likely reserved for nobles, added to dishes to signal luxury and reverence. Historians still debate how far Babylonian trade networks reached for such exotic ingredients. Some argue these spices came from as far as India, while others think local variants existed. You watch as the child carefully measures a pinch of saffron into a bowl, and you think about how these tiny additions could transform simple meals into sensory feasts, touching taste, smell, and even sight. It feels like the kitchen here was less about sustenance and more about celebration. A daily ritual wrapped in layers of meaning and delight. A faint sound of water guides you next to the kitchen's washing area, where stone basins are filled with clear, cool water drawn from the nearby Euphrates. The cooks and apprentices rinse bowls and utensils with practiced motions, the sound of flowing water mixing with the soft clatter of pottery. You notice that hygiene in these kitchens was surprisingly advanced for its time. Clay pipes channeled wastewater away, and some areas had designated dumping spots to keep food preparation clean. One cook explains that many recipes even included instructions for washing hands and tools before starting, a ritual that went beyond cleanliness to symbolize purity and respect for the food. You recall stories of crocodile dung being used as sunscreen elsewhere in history, and smile to yourself. Babylonian chefs had their own ways, thankfully less itchy. Historians still argue about how widespread and consistent these hygiene practices were, and whether they were primarily religious or practical. But it's clear the Babylonians took their food seriously, and cleanly. The gentle splash of water and the rhythm of scrubbing create a soothing background noise, the kitchen's version of white noise. It's easy to imagine yourself here, slowing down, letting the day's worries wash away. You find yourself drawn to a quieter corner, where a slender woman in faded robes is carefully folding thin sheets of dough filled with a fragrant mix of lentils and herbs. These delicate parcels, called kabu, will soon be boiled or fried, their crisp exteriors hiding soft, savory surprises. The woman hums a tune, perhaps the same one you heard earlier near the garden, as her fingers work nimbly and patiently. Kabu are a perfect example of how Babylonian cuisine balanced texture and flavor, using simple ingredients to create layered experiences. You lean closer to watch her fold the last piece, impressed by the care involved in every crease. This isn't rushed cooking, it's deliberate, meditative, a practice that invites calm. Kabu recipes varied from household to household, with secret blends of spices handed down like family heirlooms. Some included almonds, others onions, and a few even incorporated pomegranate molasses for a subtle tang. Historians still debate how much of Babylonian food culture was influenced by neighboring regions versus indigenous creativity. But this folded treat seems to reflect both, a fusion wrapped in dough. As you watch, you realize that food here isn't just survival, it's a soft ritual, a slow dance that carries history in every bite. You breathe out, feeling more relaxed than you have in hours, carried gently by the kitchen's quiet rhythms. The hum of the kitchen fades as you move toward the storage cellars below. Here, in the cool, shadowed depths, rows of jars and baskets hold staples like dried fish, salted meats, and preserved fruits. The air is musty but comforting, redolent of earth and ancient secrets. You notice the care taken in stacking and labeling, with pictograms indicating contents and expected shelf life. Preservation was crucial. Without refrigeration, the Babylonians relied on salt, drying, and fermentation to stretch their food through harsh seasons. Among the jars, you find a curious container marked with symbols meaning honey wine, a sweet, mildly intoxicating beverage often served at feasts. It was thought to lift the spirit, making it a favored drink during celebrations. Historians still argue whether these cellars were communal stores or belonged to wealthy households exclusively. Some evidence suggests that royal kitchens had large dedicated spaces, while common folk used simpler storage methods. As you run your fingers along the cool stone wall, you reflect on how every jar here carries a story of patience and planning, qualities not always associated with the ancient world but vital to its survival. Climbing back up, you return to the kitchen's main hearth, where a large pot simmers gently over the embers. The cook stirs slowly, sending up fragrant steam that blends notes of cumin, coriander, and a hint of smoked fish. You lean closer to inhale the aroma, feeling it seep into your senses like a warm blanket. This is the heart of Babylonian comfort food, a stew meant to nourish both body and soul. You learn that recipes were often adjusted on the fly, depending on what was available or which guests were expected. There was an improvisational quality beneath the carefully carved stone instructions, a dance between tradition and spontaneity. Historians still debate how standardized Babylonian recipes really were. Did scribes create official versions, while everyday cooks made their own? The answer might be both, culinary creativity within structured guidelines. The cook ladles a small bowl for you, and the rich, smoky broth soothes your throat. You notice a small piece of date tucked inside, a sweet surprise that lingers after every sip. You smile, thinking that maybe ancient Babylonian chefs really understood comfort, something you might want to borrow for your own late-night snacks. As the day winds down, you find yourself in a cozy corner where a scribe gently traces new recipe tablets. Her stylus moves deftly over the soft clay, capturing not just ingredients and steps but notes on timing, texture, and even presentation. These scribes were the unseen custodians of culinary knowledge, translating fleeting kitchen moments into lasting records. Their work ensured that recipes could travel beyond a single household, preserving tastes for generations. You watch as she pauses, adding a small flourish, a cuneiform flourish that might mean favorite or highly recommended. There is pride here, a sense of artistry in recording something as ordinary yet extraordinary as food. Historians still argue about how widespread literacy was among cooks and how often scribes collaborated directly with chefs. Was this partnership common or a rare luxury? The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. The scribe's quiet focus invites you to appreciate the slow, deliberate craft behind every meal. It's not just about nourishment, it's about connection, to culture, to family, to history itself. You feel grateful to witness this moment, a gentle reminder that even the humblest recipe has a story worth telling. You stroll toward the palace kitchens, where the scale and grandeur feel entirely different. Here, the clatter is louder, the smells richer, and the staff bustling with practiced energy. Banquets in Babylon were extravagant affairs, meant to impress both gods and guests. Tables groaned under roasted meats, sweetened breads, and copious amounts of wine. The menu was a performance, with each dish carefully planned and timed. You overhear a cook explaining how dishes were often named for their shapes or symbolic ingredients, like lion's paw stew or moonlight pudding, to add a poetic touch to the feast. Historians still debate how much of this theatricality was genuine versus a form of political theater. Were these banquets sincere celebrations or displays of power? Probably a bit of both. The palace kitchen feels alive with whispers and secrets, and you can't help but admire the skill required to feed so many mouths with elegance and precision. Amidst the bustle, you find a moment to breathe and imagine yourself as part of this grand culinary spectacle, an invisible guest savoring history one bite at a time. Back in the quieter residential quarters, you find a group of children learning to cook under the watchful eye of an elder. The lessons are gentle, filled with laughter and the occasional flour-dusted cheek. You watch as the children practice kneading dough, shaping small bread loaves, and mixing simple stews. Their work is careful but unhurried, a hands-on education in both skill and patience. The elder tells stories of how food connects generations, teaching respect for nature and community. These moments remind you that cooking was as much about passing on wisdom as it was about feeding bodies. Historians still debate how formalized such culinary education was. Were these lessons widespread or limited to privileged families? The evidence is sparse but suggests that food knowledge was treasured and shared. The children giggle as they taste their efforts, their faces lighting up with the joy of discovery. You smile, feeling that this timeless scene offers a perfect note of hope and continuity. The day's work winds down as you return to the kitchen one last time. The fire pits glow softly, and the cooks begin tidying, their movements slower, more reflective. You think back over all you've seen, the stone-carved recipes, the fragrant gardens, the bubbling ferments, and the careful recordings. Each detail paints a picture of a world where food was both practical and poetic, a daily ritual steeped in care. You realize that Babylonian chefs weren't just cooks, they were historians, scientists, and artists. Their legacy carved in stone isn't merely about meals, it's about human connection across time. Historians still debate many details, but one truth remains clear: the love and labor poured into every dish is a quiet, enduring whisper from the past. You close your eyes, breathing in the warmth and aromas one last time, letting the gentle rhythm of this ancient kitchen lull you toward rest. Now, as the kitchen quiets completely and the last embers glow low, you feel the soft weight of calm settling over you. The bustling sounds have faded to a gentle murmur, like a lullaby sung by time itself. Imagine the scent of baked bread and sweet spices drifting on a slow, evening breeze. Nothing urgent, no hurry, just the simple comfort of a day's work done. You can almost feel the cool stones beneath your feet, the whispered exchange of recipes passed hand to hand, the warm hands folding dough with tender care. All these small, quiet moments blend into a soft tapestry of peace. Let your thoughts drift like smoke curling from a hearth, loose and gentle. You are cradled by centuries of human kindness, the everyday magic of cooking and sharing food. Here, history isn't a distant roar but a soothing hum, inviting you to rest. As you settle deeper, know that the ancient kitchen story is also yours now, a slow rhythm to carry you toward sleep. There is no rush, only the warm glow of tradition, patience, and care. So breathe deeply, let your muscles soften, and close your eyes, carried by this gentle, timeless feast.